Kirby Air Ride has always been an extremely fascinating video game to me. For more than 2 decades, it was the final Kirby title to be directed by the series creator Masahiro Sakurai. And rather than make some grand new 3D adventure utilizing the power of the GameCube, he would instead choose to make an experimental racing spin-off title that would go on to be Kirby's only game for the console. Although there was originally going to be a proper mainline Kirby title for the system, but that's a story best saved for another time. Regardless, Kirby Air Ride is a pretty interesting game, and it's remained somewhat divisive for many fans and casuals alike, with it reviewing pretty poorly at the time of its release. The game has never been re-released at any point, so it's likely an entire generation of Kirby fans will be going into its sequel, Air Riders, without a great idea about what the game truly entails. So for this video, I wanted to dive into this game to showcase what makes it special, and why I fully believe it deserves this new sequel more than 2 decades later. Kirby Air Ride itself has a pretty fascinating history to it. In fact, I've actually already briefly discussed it before, as a version of this game would appear as a playable demo at Shoshinkai 1995, an annual trade show held in Japan by Nintendo. At this event, they would display a game known as Kirby Bull, which featured 2 distinct gameplay styles, one being a pseudo follow-up to another Kirby spin-off known as Dream Course, which had a small playable demo for some attendees to try, with the second version shown off being a basic snowboarding-like game, which to my knowledge was only seen in some gameplay previews. The game would reappear again at E3 1996, now going by the name Kirby's Air Ride, and now focused primarily on the snowboarding gameplay. A newer version of the game would be seen in a promotional video featuring a distinct Kirby with a backwards cap. However, this small snippet of gameplay would mark the final time the game would appear publicly, with no word on any date being given out by 1997, and by March of 1998, the game would completely vanish from all official listings for upcoming titles, signifying its silent cancellation. Although it honestly doesn't seem like most people were interested in the game to begin with, as it frequently ranked near the very bottom for Japan's most anticipated N64 titles. Regardless, to me, it seems like Kirby's Air Ride at this point was pretty directionless. Something that becomes fairly obvious when you look at just how different the game looked every single time it appeared publicly, and it would take involvement from the series creator himself to finally craft a proper Kirby racing game. Although according to Sakurai, the 2 games don't actually share any relation to each other beyond the obvious title and some ideas of what worked and what didn't. As for the GameCube Kirby Air Ride, it would first be seen at a DICE Summit event in March of 2003, with the game releasing only a few months later. And as mentioned before, it would end up reviewing fairly poorly by many Western outlets. So why is that? Was even Sakurai not able to craft something out of this, or was the game simply misunderstood? Well, let's start with the game modes. Kirby Air Ride is built quite differently from most of its contemporaries and is designed in a similar way to Sakurai's previous Kirby title, Kirby Superstar, the first of which being Air Ride. This is a high-speed racing mode between 4 players with 8 different tracks on offer by default, with an extra one being unlockable later on. The game's controls were designed to be extremely simple, as it only uses one button for most actions, and the control stick to move Kirby left and right, with acceleration happening automatically. The A button is instead used for everything else. The main function by default is to hold yourself in place, which also begins a charging speed boost, making it ideal for making sharp turns. However, the A button also has a few other functions, such as using it to inhale enemies that are nearby, which can grant temporary copy abilities that can be used to attack other racers and enemies. Offense is a pretty important part of Kirby Air Ride's gameplay, as while there are no items in the game, you can freely attack any racer by performing the spinning technique by spinning the stick, which can do a lot to slow down a competitor, and by defeating enemies, you'll gain a small speed boost, so it's always better to stomp them out if you see them. Copy abilities in particular can really do a lot of damage, with my personal favorites being the Sword, which automatically slashes any nearby enemy or racer, Needle, which triggers an immediate attack anytime a racer or enemy is nearby, and the Wing, which offers an immense boost to Kirby's flight capabilities, which is another unique mechanic in Air Ride. Essentially, when you're driving off ramps, you'll get a small lift in the air, which allows you to glide, the strength of which depends greatly on the type of machine you picked. The vehicles in Kirby Air Ride are all quite unique from one another. with virtually all of them handling vastly differently from each other and containing their own unique gimmicks that alter how you play. By default, the Warp Star is your basic vehicle with no real strengths or weaknesses and is pretty easy to control. Eventually, as you play, you'll unlock quite a few other machines, such as the Wing Star, which is a little slow on the ground but offers an incredibly strong boost to air control and speed, making it an ideal pick for gliding, which can be quite powerful on certain tracks like the Celestial Valley. The Swerve Star is extremely fast with virtually no acceleration, moving at top speed the entire time, essentially making it sort of an unstoppable force. However, you cannot move left or right on the control stick while on the Swerve Star, with the only method of shifting your direction being your charge, which holds you in place, allowing you to aim the machine. While its control scheme may be off-putting to some, it's a very powerful machine in the right hands and a favorite among many players. The Bulk Star on its own has no acceleration and can only move by charging it in place, which then grants it a slow but powerful burst of speed before needing to be charged again, making it a fairly volatile but pretty fun machine to try and win with. The Slick Star, which as its name implies, is very slippery, making it pretty hard to handle. However, its overall stats are quite high, making it a potentially viable machine if you're able to master its odd handling. And then there's the 3 wheelie bikes, which each handle quite differently compared to most of the game's basic stars, with all of them being uniquely affected by the various terrain effects that other machines would simply float above. To compensate, the wheelies each have their own strengths, with the basic one being a simple machine with good handling and high speed. The Wheelie Rex having a high top speed and strong offensive capabilities and defense, but has poor handling and acceleration. And the Wheelie Scooter, which has great acceleration and handling along with the best jumping capabilities, as all of the wheelies are unable to glide and instead get a strong jump boost, which the scooter excels at greatly. Also, you can perform actual wheelies with them by tilting back on the control stick, which I find amusing. In addition, there are 2 special riders you can unlock as you play, those being King Dedede and Meta Knight, who differ from Kirby as they're both unable to absorb enemies or use other machines. Meta Knight essentially functions as a slight reskin of Kirby's Wing with the additional ability of sword swings. He's pretty fun overall, if a bit derivative and limited with what he can do. Dedede is similar in that regard, as he uses a wheelie bike for his machine and can swing his hammer to attack. They're both neat additions to the game overall, although a bit underdeveloped, which is likely why they're such a focus for the sequel. But you may be wondering how you actually unlock these characters. Well, in order to obtain these special characters along with other things like vehicles, alternative music tracks, and colors for Kirby, the player needs to engage with the checklist. This is a pretty notable feature of the game, being a wall of 120 different objectives for the player to fulfill. Things like time trials with specific vehicles, finishing courses with certain copy abilities, or more track-oriented objectives, like hitting all 3 of these grind rails within the track Magma Flows while still hitting first place. There's also a few cumulative objectives, like defeating over 1,000 enemies or gliding for 30 minutes, which is how you unlock Dedede and Meta Knight respectively, and by racing over 100 laps, you'll unlock the game's secret track, the Nebula Belt. And despite being the game's only unlockable course and having a really cool appearance, it's honestly one of the game's simplest tracks, with no real gimmicks to speak of outside of these panels, which give random copy abilities. The checklist kinda brings up one of the biggest issues I think a lot of people have with Air Ride, and that's the lack of single-player content. As this mode has no Grand Prix, these objectives will likely make up the bulk of your solo playtime, which may be fairly polarizing just due to the sheer volume of challenges here. On the one hand, I do find many of these challenges pretty fun to attempt, and they got me to play in different ways and try out different machines that I likely would have ignored otherwise. On the other hand, I don't think the game has quite enough rewards to hand out for these to feel satisfying to complete, as many of the spaces featured here are blank, serving no real purpose other than to mark the challenge itself as complete. So to me, the checklist has its ups and downs, although I do overall think it's a fun mechanic, but not one I'd never go out of my way to fully complete, especially since each game mode itself has its own checklist, meaning there are about 360 different challenges, and some can get pretty brutal, or just downright boring, which we'll discuss later. Overall, Air Ride is a simple but fun game mode that serves as a strong basis for the game, with my only major criticism being the lack of content on offer if you're playing solo. Granted, I think this game mode and game as a whole was probably more meant to be played with friends. Still, I do think other racing titles on this console itself, like F-Zero GX, offer a much wider net of single-player offerings, so Air Ride could have easily been better in this regard, which is something I think a lot of reviews justly criticized at the time. Probably my favorite thing about this mode, and potentially Air Ride as a whole, is that it does a great job of making every machine offered within it feel wholly unique from one another, with all of them offering completely different playstyles that can greatly change how you approach each track. That gives Air Ride a special edge that many other racing titles have a hard time competing with. Obviously, in something like Mario Kart, the vehicles and characters you pick will still affect how you play, but Air Ride's machines offer such radically different gameplay styles that the other two and many racing games in general can't compare to. Sakurai himself, during the first Kirby Air Riders Direct, would directly compare Air Ride to Mario Kart, but to me, that description doesn't do justice just how truly one-of-a-kind Kirby Air Ride's basic gameplay is to virtually anything else on the market, and this has sort of remained true even 20 years after the game's release. But maybe this was just his way of introducing the game to people who weren't entirely sure what Air Rider is. So hopefully this gave you a better idea as to what at least one of the game's main modes entails. As for the other modes, first up we have Top Ride. As the name implies, Top Ride is a top-down racing mode with 7 tracks available. This mode features trimmed-down gameplay compared to Air Ride being significantly slower paced and more beginner-friendly. Unlike the previous mode, this one actually does feature items that occasionally drop in during the race. There's a cake slice that makes you big, an ice power-up that gives you a frontal attack, a hammer that attacks nearby enemies and players, as well as the classic invincibility candy which makes you immune to all attacks and stage hazards, the latter of which are a lot more plentiful in Top Ride, with things like this giant fly trap in the sand course, this massive rotating platform in the sky course, or these gears in the metal course whose direction can change depending on the switch pressed prior. Overall, it's a pretty simple, albeit somewhat hectic mode, and one that I unfortunately feel doesn't offer that much that the other game modes don't do a better job at. Maybe this is a personal thing, but I sort of feel like this style of overhead racing had already fallen out of favor with most gamers by the time this game released. And I don't feel like Top Ride as a whole offers anything new or refreshing enough to really warrant its existence here. Top Ride just doesn't feel equal to the other two game modes in terms of both quality and quantity of content on offer. This isn't to imply that it's like bad or broken, it's just uninteresting. In spite of that, the game still treats it as equal to the other two modes, with it having its own full checklist with 120 missions that are honestly some of the worst in the game, having many that are simply get X item this amount of times, with virtually no rewards to actually give out to the player, as this mode only has 2 machines that are unlocked by default, with the only difference between them being a slightly different control scheme. The only actual unlockables in Top Ride are some music and a few extra items added to the pool of randomly dropped ones, which both hardly do anything to spice up the gameplay here. Listen, I do like this game a lot and wanted to be a bit more positive about this mode since I always remembered it being boring, but my opinion on it hasn't really changed. You could easily argue that this mode is inoffensive, and to a certain extent I would probably agree with that, but with it being 1/3 of the game's main modes, it leaves a lot to be desired. Hopefully its return in Air Riders will give me a new perspective on it, but for now, I'm not a huge Top Ride fan, and I think that general feeling carries for a lot of players. Alright, now we've reached what I believe is Kirby Air Ride's most defining game mode, City Trial. This mode is unlike anything else seen within the racing genre and is something that is wholly unique to Air Ride as a game and has never really been replicated by anything else. Essentially, 4 players are dropped into a large open city map with a weak machine exclusive to this mode known as the Compact Star. From there, each player is then left to their own devices to find a new, stronger vehicle randomly strewn throughout the city, along with power-ups as well as power-downs that will greatly increase or decrease your machine's performance, potentially turning it into something completely different to what it initially started out as. Item boxes appear frequently throughout the map, which can contain power-ups or other special items, like the battery, which offers an insanely comical speed boost that allows you to fly around the map like supersonic, or Gordos and bombs you can use to deal massive damage to other players. City Trial machines actually feature health bars, meaning if they lose all available HP, your machine will break and you'll be forced to find a new one on foot, wasting time and losing you many of the power-ups you've collected. Once the time is run out, the results are tallied up, and you are then brought into a random event known as a stadium, which vary from single lap races on one of the game's main courses, to simple straight-line drag races, to direct battles with other players, or mini-games utilizing the gliding. As such, not only do the power-ups you collect matter greatly for the stadium event, but the machine you use also has a massive impact on your performance. For example, if you have a heavy machine like the Bulk Star and get a stadium event like Air Glider, you'll likely have a hard time accomplishing much. However, the opposite may be true if you get a machine like the Formula Star, which specializes in straight lines. And then get a drag race, which is essentially just a race in a simple straight line, you'll likely have a much easier time winning. So at times, City Trial can be rather unpredictable. Occasionally during a match, you may get a prediction that hint towards the final stadium event, but you can still easily get unlucky and not find anything suitable for the event in question, leading to some matches feeling somewhat lopsided, especially due to just how insanely overtuned some machines can become with just a few dozen power-ups. City Trial is extremely chaotic, with so many different things going on during a match, including random events like the appearance of the Dynablade, which you can attempt to defeat for a massive amount of free power-ups, silent hill fog that greatly obstructs your view, or fake power-ups that hurt and downgrade you if you touch them. There's so many variables that can happen in this mode that it makes every match feel different. If I had to compare it to something, I'd say City Trial is honestly closer to the sheer anarchy of the Mario Party series, which I enjoy greatly. And in spite of how seemingly random and chaotic this mode can be, City Trial has actually gone on to spawn its own little community of people who actively play the game at a high level, which I believe is a testament to not only the mode's overall quality, but also the uniqueness of it, as there's virtually nothing else like it that you can find in any other game. Probably my favorite aspect of this mode that we've yet to discuss are the legendary machines. Essentially, when opening these red item boxes, there's a chance for a piece of one of these machines to drop. 3 pieces are required, and once assembled, you gain access to easily the most overpowered machines in the game. The first is the Dragoon, which you'll likely recognize from the Super Smash Bros. Series, which pays homage to the original Dragoon by having you collect 3 pieces to assemble. This vehicle is pretty absurd in all categories, which can honestly make it a bit hard to control sometimes, but it makes up for it with its obscene stats. Chief among them being its unrivaled gliding capabilities, allowing it to stay airborne for long periods of time. The other machine is the Hydra, which is similarly overpowered, albeit this one has to actually charge itself up to move like the Bulk Star. But once it gets going, it's pretty ridiculous, boasting insane speed and offensive capabilities that make colliding with a moving Hydra incredibly dangerous. You can even unlock the individual pieces via the City Trial checklist to eventually create the machines for free use and free run. Although I will admit that this checklist is fairly barren in terms of actual rewards otherwise, and also features some pretty cruel and unusual missions like this one that requires all players to simultaneously jump off their machines, which is nearly impossible unless you have 4 controllers and 4 friends who are even able to properly coordinate this. Something else I want to make note of is the actual city within City Trial itself, as it's quite expansive, featuring a lot of different areas that contain their own layers and secrets. Like this special area above the map you can find by driving into the volcano, these cave areas underneath the map, or this star you can ram into for some hidden power-ups. The map is really well designed, and as a kid I genuinely found a lot of enjoyment by just exploring the city with Kirby on foot. Keep in mind that for literal decades this was the only game that allowed you to move around with Kirby in a fully 3D space. So for a younger me, this was about as close as you could get. Regardless, City Trial is an amazing time all around and is easily the highlight of Air Ride's offerings. I even found myself playing it outside of the scope of this video just because of how fun it is. And as I've mentioned before, there really is nothing else like it in virtually any other game that I've played, which has allowed Air Ride to remain popular with a lot of people. You just can't get City Trial out of anything else but Kirby Air Ride. However, Sakurai himself would sorta try to emulate the feel of City Trial with Smash 4's Smash Run mode, which features a very similar idea of exploring a large open area while collecting power-ups before competing in an event. But I feel like it doesn't work quite as well here. Although I still do think Smash Run is a pretty decent mode that doesn't quite live up to the sheer insanity that City Trial offers. The last thing I want to highlight within Air Ride as a whole is the music, which in my opinion, to this day, still contains some of the series' best compositions with a full orchestral soundtrack that accompanies every mode, along with a plentiful array of remixes of many classic Kirby songs that you can unlock. The game's soundtrack has so many gems that it's easily become one of my favorite aspects of the game, although there's actually a decent amount of the music featured here that originates from the anime series Kirby Right Back At Ya, which itself had a special 2-part episode tie-in that features some of the vehicles from Air Ride, due to the anime's production coinciding with the game's release. In fact, Air Rider's production seemingly only came about due to Sakurai believing the series should have another way of diversifying itself. So in more ways than one, the anime and Kirby Air Ride are very tightly linked together. Sakurai himself stated that the final game was made in only 3.5 months using assets they had already made for previous versions. And yet this small project made in less than half a month has gone on to become one of the Kirby series' most fascinating titles and the final one to feature Masahiro Sakurai's personal touch. Something that to me can be kinda just felt in every aspect of the game. It's really hard to explain with words, but to me, Kirby Air Ride's entire essence really just screams Masahiro Sakurai. All in all, I have a pretty strong soft spot for this game, and while it didn't review very well at the time, the game did manage to sell over 1 million copies, and has gone on to become beloved by a specific niche of people who still play and discuss the game to this day. One of those actually seems to come from Japan, as while the GameCube was one of the least popular Nintendo systems over there, Kirby Air Ride has seemingly remained as one of its most popular titles, as 2 different surveys conducted to find out what Japan believes are the best video games ever made somehow both had Kirby Air Ride listed on them. I really can't stress enough just how odd it is to me that the game has seemingly remained in the minds of Japanese gamers, since most of the GameCube's library is relatively unpopular in Japan. But against all odds, Kirby Air Ride has apparently stood the test of time enough to be named as one of the best games ever according to many folks in Japan. All of this might explain why the game is receiving a sequel 20 years later, which I still do believe it fully deserves. In spite of reviewing pretty poorly at the time, the game sold more than enough to justify a sequel and could have easily ironed out many of the problems people had with it at the time. However, Sakurai had already left HAL Laboratories at this point, so it's likely they didn't want to create another one without him. Either way, the game is now finally getting the chance to have a sequel on the far more successful Switch 2. So hopefully more people are able to understand why Kirby Air Ride has become a classic of the GameCube's library in spite of some of its issues.